Welcome to Changing Course, a podcast where we explore how people navigate change and find their balance afterwards. I'm your host, Maya Adam, and our guest today is the legendary filmmaker and television director, Barry Sonnenfeld. Barry is responsible for directing some iconic films like The Addams Family, Get Shorty, and the Men in Black trilogy. As a cinematographer, he collaborated with the Coen brothers on films like Blood Simple, Raising Arizona, and Miller's Crossing. He worked with Danny DeVito on Throw Mama from the Train, and with Rob Reiner on one of my favorite films of all time, When Harry Met Sally. He has an incredibly interesting life story, which he shared in his unforgettable 2020 memoir, and it's called Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother. And Barry, I'm leaning to the side because I actually have the book behind me. I first met Barry when he and his equally impressive wife, Susan Ringo, were working on a film in Vancouver, Canada that was more than 15 years ago. And I am so excited to introduce him to all of you today. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you, Maya. Yes, I remember two things about meeting both your husband, Lawrence, and about meeting you. We were in Vancouver filming the Robin Williams comedy RV, and we heard about this apartment, but we had a very large dog. And Lawrence was willing to rent your wonderful penthouse apartment to us, but said he had to meet the dog first because he wasn't sure about this. I walk in with our 110-pound Rhodesian Ridgeback, and Lawrence, being South African, said, well, that was the one dog I would have said yes to. So we got the apartment. But when I met you and Lawrence, we went to dinner in Vancouver at Giappino's. Mm-hmm. And I said to my wife, I call her Sweetie, I said, look, we're going to have dinner with our landlord and his wife. And Sweetie said, only you would agree to have, what are we going to talk about? How are we going to have dinner with these people? And of course, you and Lawrence are so impressive. Prima ballerina in, was it Berlin or Dresden?
Dresden. You have a great memory, Barry. This is impressive.
Prima ballerina. Lawrence has climbed most of the highest mountains in the world. So you had all these fascinating questions, and Sweetie and I were saying things like, what's your favorite color? You know, so we were so blessed to meet you guys, and you guys got stuck with us. So it's a pleasure to be here with you.
I feel so grateful. Barry, you know, the theme of this podcast is navigating change. And you are one of the people that I know who's navigated some really unusual and really interesting changes in your life. And I've been lucky to actually hear some of those stories firsthand. I've also been lucky to read them in your book, which it's very unusual for me to laugh out loud while I'm reading a book, but your book made me laugh out loud. It moved me. It was so powerful. And so I wanted to first ask you to tell us the story of how your book got its name.
Sure. Well, my parents were, I'm an only child, which already gives you about all the information you need. An only child of Jewish persuasion. So you already know the story. Both my parents were very narcissistic, and my father ignored my mother, and my mother just overprotected me. So I was at Madison Square Garden. There was a anti-Vietnam concert. There were 19,600 people there. I was a senior in high school at music and art. I was a French horn player. So that's the first transition to a different life. And by the way, the reason I was a French horn player was because when I was 10, I wanted to play the trumpet. 10 years old, my mother says, no, there are too many trumpet players, but if you play the French horn, if you get drafted in 8 years from now, if the Vietnam War escalates, there are so few horn players, you'll be in the Army band instead of in the infantry, so you won't die. So that's how protective my mother was. She made me play the French horn. Good thinking. So it's 2:20 in the morning. Jimi Hendrix is warming up for the second time because he was going through some issues and didn't feel the vibes. And I was warming up for the second time. He's about to start playing. I'm with my date and over the PA system. While he's warming up, about to start his first song, 19,600 people, comes the PA announcement, Barry Sonnenfeld, call your mother. So, of course, because I start weeping, because I know the only reason I could get paid is that my father has died. And second of all, because I stand up, because I'm standing up, everyone knows I'm Barry Sonnenfeld. So immediately, the chant, I'm in the cheap blue seats of Barry, because it's a garden, right? And that's what we do. So Jimmy is already a little freaked out. I go, I'm weeping. I put a dime in the phone. I call my mother and I said, who died? And she says, well, I thought you did. I said, why would you think I was dead? She said, well, you said you would be home by 2. It's 2:20. And I said, yeah, but Mom, didn't they tell you the concert was still going on? She said, yeah, but they couldn't find you. They couldn't tell me you were safe. So, and Dad, of course, was sound asleep and fine. So that's how the book got its title.
Well, I just love it. I think it's hilarious. And I think, you had so much courage to pursue a career that like very few people succeed in the world that you've succeeded in. And so I kind of wonder, and I'd love to hear from you, if you were ever sort of scared that you wouldn't make it in that world, or was there a backup plan?
It's funny. I somehow, and again, probably because I was the only child of Jewish persuasion, I somehow thought that even before I knew what I wanted to do in life, and I was never a film buff, I had no interest in film, I felt somehow I would be successful. I didn't know what. I thought maybe I'd want to be an architect, but there was too much math. Maybe an astronomer, too much math. FM DJ, not the right voice for radio. And, my dad always said to me, figure out what you want to do in life, and somehow you'll make a living doing it. Don't just take a job. Do something what you want to do in life, and you'll figure out a way to make a living. And it's funny because Dad figured out what to do in life, which was to be a salesman, but we were always without rent, phone, electricity. We had to avoid Lou the butcher. So I'm thinking, right, so he did what he wanted to do in life, but he's not really making a living at it. But in any case, that advice, and I'll give that advice, my 2 pieces of advice for everyone is figure out what you want to do in life, and you'll figure out a way to make a living doing it. Very Dad. And the other thing I would say is don't work your way up. Decide what you want to do and do it. In my case, and I'll tell you how I ended up in graduate film school at NYU, but in my case, I bought a camera when I got, and this is pre-video, this is 16 millimeter film, 35 millimeter film. I bought a used 16 millimeter camera because I felt if I owned a camera, I could call myself a cameraman without being a dilettante, because I actually am a cameraman, and here's my camera. So, I ended up meeting Joel Coen at a party. He and his brother Ethan had written the script for Blood Simple. They are in my first movie. And Joel and I were talking at this party. We were the only 2 Jews. I seem to be talking about Judaism a lot, and I'm an atheist. But in any case, Joel said that he and his brother Ethan were going to shoot a trailer as if Blood Simple was a finished movie and use that trailer to raise $750,000 to make the movie. I said, I own a camera. He said, you're hired, because they were cheap. They didn't know if I was good or not, but I owned the camera. We shot the trailer for Blood Simple over President's Weekend in the States. It took us a year, but we raised the $750,000. And the first day that Joel, Ethan, and I were shooting Blood Simple was the first day any of us had ever been on a movie set. I didn't work my way up. I was never a camera assistant, a camera operator, all the things normally you would do to become a cameraman. Joel was never an editor or second AD or first AD assistant director. Ethan had never produced. He was a statistical typist at Macy's, typing serial numbers, because if you only typed serial numbers, you got an extra 50 cents an hour, because no one wanted to do that. Ethan had been a philosophy major at Princeton, didn't want to go back, and wrote a letter as if written by his parents, saying he had lost both of his legs in a wood chipper accident and was too embarrassed to go back to Princeton. His parents didn't know that Ethan had dropped out. Obviously, Ethan hadn't lost his legs. But again, Joel and Ethan didn't work their way up either. They became producers, directors, writers. I became a DP. So my two pieces of advice would be, figure out what you want to do in life and do it. You'll figure out a way to make money. And second of all, don't work your way up. Just do that thing. It worked for me. It's not the only way to do it, by the way. Others have different approaches.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit about that sort of fake it until you become it thing, where you just go for it. And then at some point it becomes reality.
That's right. Absolutely. That's what happened with me. I thought I wanted to be a still photographer. You know, I bought a used Leica, and I was trying to imitate my favorite photographers, Gary Winogrand and Elliot Erwitt and Lee Friedlander. But I realized still photography was a fairly lonely thing. You know, you didn't really work within a group. And I had a certain sense of wanting to be in a social environment.
Yeah.
And I was working at a place called Frenchie's Color Lab, and I knew that was not sustainable, but I had graduated college and didn't know what I was going to do. And my mother said, why don't you go to graduate film school? Your father and I will pay for film school. You love photography. You love writing. Film is just a lot of still photographs and words, which it isn't. So I applied to NYU Graduate Film School. Of course, I got in based on my photo portfolio. And then, of course, my mother said, my mother, by the way, was also a pathological liar. I never said I'd pay, your dad and I would pay for your graduate school. Look at us. We have no money. We have no electricity. Good point, Mom. So I took out a lot of student loans, and I became a teaching assistant in my second year, so I had no tuition issues, although film is a very expensive thing to do. You know, the film stock and development of the film is very expensive. But again, I got out of graduate film school and I realized I had an ability to light and shoot movies. But I had no interest in films. I was not a movie buff. I think I had seen maybe Dr. Strangelove, you know. Yeah, it all worked out. But if I wasn't a filmmaker, I would have done something else and probably been vaguely successful in it.
Yeah. And Barry, were there moments in your career when you had to make a big pivot? Like, I'm thinking about my own pivot from the world of dance to the world of medicine. And for me, I kind of waited until it was sort of impossible to continue along that path before I turned the corner. Did you have any pivotal moments like that? And what were the signs for you?
This won't help your podcast, but that's not me. when I became a cameraman, and I'm writing my second book, and I just reread the New York Times review of Blood Simple, which talked about how visually dazzling it was, and the reviewer specifically mentioned my name as the cameraman and how specific and again dazzling the images were, and that moved me on my career. And I was very happy in that career and had no interest in changing my career because I was good at it. I could look at a scene and know exactly where to put the camera, where the light should go. And then Scott Rudin, who had been the head of the president of production at Fox, 20th Century Fox, on two of the movies I had shot, Raising Arizona with the Coens, and then Big with Penny Marshall. And Scott was now an independent producer wanting to make Addams Family. And he knew he wanted a very stylized looking comedy. And most comedies aren't stylized. They're multiple cameras, the lighting is very flat, there's a lot of improv, but it's not specific in terms of the design of the shots. Scott went to Terry Gilliam, he went to Tim Burton, they both passed, and then I was in Los Angeles with Sweetie, got a phone call. We were staying at the Four Seasons Hotel. Hello, Mrs. Sonnenfeld. Scott Rudin just dropped off a script for you. He wants you to read it and meet him in 2 hours at Hugo's, which was a local restaurant. I read the script, and for me to read a script in 2 hours is tough, but I did it. And he wanted me to be the director. And I went and I met him. I said, why do you want me to direct this? And he said, well, Terry Gilliam passed, Tim Burton passed. Once all the good directors passed, I thought, I'll take a chance with you. I said, oh, thanks a lot, Scott. I told him all the reasons. And by the way, weirdly, if there was any movie I should direct as a first-time director, it was Addams Family. I was a huge fan of the Charles Addams cartoons that appeared in the New Yorker. It was very dark humor, very visual. So I became a director. And the first movie I directed, Addams Family, was predicted to open to $12.5 million, which was a lot of money back in whenever it was, 89, 90, 91. And it opened to twice that amount. So my career had been made, and one thing led to the next. And then many years later, Maya, I was sitting at home one day in Telluride, Colorado, where we lived, even though we don't ski. And Sweetie and I are very lucky in the same way I've never had to shift gears by my decision so much as people making them for me. Mm-hmm. We just buy houses and then live there. You know, we had no interest in living in Telluride. Suddenly we're living in Telluride. We had no interest living in Pemberton, British Columbia. We saw this house. Okay, let's do that. So in any case, I was in Telluride. I was bored one day, and I wrote an essay about a moment in my life, which was, we won't go into the details, but I just for myself wrote this essay about the time I shot 9 feature-length pornos in 9 days, right? So I read this essay. Yes, you did. Chapter 19. And put it away. About a year later, I say, hey, Sweetie, will you read this? We're in bed together. And we're always in bed together. And she reads the essay, and she is laughing out loud. She's shaking the bed. Even though we're not having sex, she's shaking the bed. And I said, what do you think? And Sweetie used to be an editor. She was a journalist and an editor. And she said, it's really funny. Great. Put it away. That's the end of that. Yet another year later, David Granger, who was the editor-in-chief of Esquire magazine, and I used to have a column in Esquire called The Digital Man, where I would write every month about gadgets, iPhones, television sets, whatever. Granger had left and had become a literary agent. And he called me up out of the blue and he said, "Do you have a book in you?"
Huh.
And I said, maybe, I don't know. And I said, "I'll send you this chapter." And I found it somewhere and I sent him the chapter. He said, "This is great. Write 2 more chapters and we can sell this." So I wrote Barry Sonnenfeld, Call Your Mother, about the chapter about being page at Madison Square Garden. And I also wrote a chapter called Fear of Flying, which was both about my mother thinking she was having a heart attack the first time we were ever on an airplane, a 707, and she forced the pilot to drop all the masks. So there's all these swinging masks with my mother sitting there sucking on oxygen. So it's why I've always been fearful of flying. In fact, my quote is that every time I get off an airplane, I view it as a failed suicide attempt. And then I was in a plane crash in Van Nuys Airport, so I wrote about that. So we had the 3 chapters. We went to 6 New York publishers. All 6 wanted the book, made a decision about which one. So I must say, Maya, I've been very lucky in that I've lived in a way that these opportunities have come to me. I mean, I've seized them, but I think that my pivot from directing to writing, in a way, is kind of coming full circle, because I didn't want to be a still photographer because it was too asocial.
Yeah.
And now I'm writing, which is even less socially invasive than being a still photographer, and I'm loving it. Yeah. I never have had writer's block. I sit down and I just vomit the pages out. So in my case, I have not been someone who has had to make those decisions, except to embrace them when they've come my way.
Yeah, which in itself it's a skill to be able to recognize opportunities and move in the right direction. And I mean, I may be wrong, but it seems to me, Barry, just looking at your career, that you never threw yourself at something with that kind of counterintuitive passion that sometimes people, they throw themselves at something too hard. And you have a lovely way of, through your humor and your ability to kind of do many things, you've allowed those opportunities to come your way. Wouldn't you say?
I would say that. I will say that that's not to say I don't take my work very seriously. I always tell people I don't take myself seriously, but I take my work seriously. So if you had seen me on Blood Simple, you would have seen me every 3rd day vomiting from stress. I fainted on Addams Family from stress. So I feel tremendous responsibility to deliver a good product. So I'm not laissez-faire about it. But so when I'm assigned something, I can do it really well. But I've been very lucky. I mean, I will say I was very proactive in buying the camera. Mm-hmm. That got me, in with the Coens. And I've been proactive, but I have not been someone who seemed particularly passionate. I was not someone who grew up needing to dance and mm-hmm. loving to dance, or needing to be a filmmaker. I think I needed to be communicating in some way and socializing in some way, but I didn't have that kind of passion that you had. For instance, I was a very good French horn player. I went to Music and Art High School, which was the high school in New York City that was specific to artists and musicians. I was the first chair horn player in the best orchestra, but I knew I never wanted to be a French horn player. So I never applied to Juilliard because I was good at it, but I knew it was not something I wanted to do.
Light you up, yeah. I think your way is better, Barry. I think the desperation of like that many dancers, I had this too growing up, that kind of like, I would die for this one dream to come true. And it sort of backfires on you a little bit, because at some point, even if you make it, it's never going to be as incredible as what you had imagined. So I feel like the way you've done it is right, in that you were open to these related opportunities that came your way. And maybe that's the takeaway for our guests.
But look at you. I mean, you did have that passion. You did do that. And then you switched careers. And what I would say is, in both of our cases, I think the proof is that there's no right way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That there's no formula for success. And I think so much of it is how you project yourself in the world. And you project yourself in a very charming, wonderful, just warm way, and I present myself in a very neurotic, needy way, and your way works for you and my way works for me. But I would say there is no right way.
Yeah.
Having said that, I've already told your listeners, figure out what you want to do in life and do it.
Yeah.
And also figure out what you want to do in life and do it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Amazing.
don't work your way up. But you had to work your way up in so many ways. And it worked for you.
Yeah, you're right. It was a bit of a slog at times, but it did work. Okay, Barry, I want to go back to something you just said. You talked about like the stress of the work, your field, which I can imagine is incredibly cutthroat, incredibly stressful, and yet you maintain this lightness when you're in it. How so many people right now in this post-pandemic environment are dealing with immense amounts of stress. The whole world has changed and they're struggling to find their stability and their balance. What advice do you have for people that are trying to reestablish that sense of security and balance in this new world?
Oh, that's a tough one. I guess I would say embrace the insane, surreal nature of life. I think the reason I've been able to cope and succeed through stress, painting, is I was inoculated by all the surreal stuff I had to deal with growing up. So I was used to not having rent, having to avoid Lou the Butcher and walk on the other side of Broadway, of coming home and the lights being out in our apartment. So I guess what I would say is, in my case, I was, and what I became was a embracer of surreal weirdness in life. So when I'm on the set now and someone says, and the first assistant director says, I'm making this up, Will Smith thinks he's sick, we lost the location, the studio wants to shut us down, and it looks like it's going to rain tomorrow for that outdoor scene, I then say, okay, like, bring it on. So what I would say is, if you can't fight it, try to find it amusing. That's really tough to tell other people who are suffering so much. You know, there's so many people who are out of work or out of relationships or have long COVID or are ill. And I think in my case, I just sort of like grind my teeth. I get to airports at minimum of 4 hours early. Let me rephrase that. I am through security at the gate a minimum of 4 hours earlier. The first time we went to South Africa, when we saw you and Lawrence, my daughter, Chloe, figured out that on that trip, in total, we spent 24 hours in total at the airport in various times, because each flight I would insist we got to the airport a minimum of 4 hours early. So I wouldn't say I'm healthy mentally. I would say I'm very neurotic. David Letterman called me psychotic, which I'm not. Matt Lauer said on the Today Show, said I was the most neurotic guest he ever had on the show. But to me, that's sort of a badge of honor. So that's how I got through life so far.
Barry, last question, and then I'm going to let you get on with your day. If you had to, you've given so many pearls of wisdom, so many good pieces of advice. If you had to leave our listeners with one thought to help them, wake up tomorrow and embrace this changed world, or if they're on the cusp of making a decision in their lives and they're not quite sure they're going to do it, what advice would that be for them?
Here's the hardest advice that I've had to learn, and Sweetie has been really helpful about this. I am someone who always looks back to the past with regret. If only I had done that, then this would have happened. If I had done this job, that would have happened. I never should have taken that job because this happened. And Sweetie used to always say, don't look back, and it used to drive me crazy. And I've now become a slightly healthier person because I've come to embrace that. Because in Men in Black 3, I had a character called Griffin the Arcanan, who I called a quantum mechanic. He could see every possibility of every outcome of everyone on the planet every second, right? Which is very very quantum-like. There are people that believe in alternate multiverses and all that. And if you ever say, if I had done that, then this wouldn't have happened, I would say to you, if you had done that, you're right. But an hour later, because you had done that, you might have stepped out of your house and been hit by a bus. Or you might have had this happen. So there is this direction we all go in. And my advice is embrace it, accept it, somehow try to find it amusing in a surreal way, and move on with your life. Because if you had made those other decisions, you don't know what would have happened. At first you think, oh, that would have been the right decision, but a billion, trillion, quadrillion, septillion other things would have happened because you made that decision. Yeah. So this is the life you have. This is the life you're living. Maybe there's a multiverse and you did do all those other things. True. But for right now, this is where you're at. And don't look back, look forward, and try to embrace the surreal, comic nature of life, because that's all we got.
Barry, that is lovely advice. And I can't tell you how much I have enjoyed this conversation. I know that all of our listeners are going to love hearing this. And I just want to thank you for making time to speak with us. And we can't wait to follow your incredible journey and see what you're up to next.
You're so lovely, Maya. I loved your questions. I can't wait to see you and Lawrence again, meet your children again after all those years. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Changing Course. I'm Maya Adam, and I hope you enjoyed today's incredible discussion. We'll be back in the weeks ahead with more fascinating guests as we continue to explore how inspiring people navigate change and find their balance afterwards. I also love getting your messages and hearing your feedback, so please visit our website, www.changingcoursepodcast.com.